Today's lecture will be on Chapter 30, How the Corporation is Financed and the Role of the Shareholders or the Owners of the Corporation. How are corporations financed? Well, initially, before they become a corporation, promoters may promote funds before the corporation comes into existence. Then once it comes into existence, the investors may provide funds. You may get loans, and there might be equity or ownership securities or debt or loan securities. We're going to focus the next several slides on equity securities and debt securities. Equity means ownership. All corporations must issue common stock, and a corporation may or may not issue a second type of stock known as preferred stock. So if a corporation only has one class of stock, it will be common stock. Shareholders bear the risks of the business in case it fails and benefit the most from its success. Common stock generally carries voting rights, and you can vote for the board of directors as well as for amendments to the articles of incorporation. In addition, there may be multiple classes of stock, and some of the classes of common voting stock may not have voting rights. Preferred stock, as mentioned, may or may not be issued by a corporation. However, if a corporation does issue preferred shares, preferred shareholders have preferences for two major things: preferences over common shareholders of dividends, as well as a distribution of assets if the corporation is dissolved or liquidated. Oftentimes, preferred stock may be convertible to common stock at the preferred stockholder's option. And sometimes preferred stockholder may be redeemed by the corporation if it wants to do so. The corporation can redeem it, has to pay the preferred shareholders to get the stock back. Very few times does the preferred shareholder have voting rights. So how do you get stock? Shares of stock are usually issued in exchange for such things as money, property, or services. However, it's very important that the board of directors, if you're not getting money for the stock, instead property or services, place a proper value on said property or services. All shares are assigned a value. Most shares are assigned what's called the initial par value, which is an arbitrary value assigned to shares that's noted in the articles of incorporation. It's usually $1. It's the minimum amount of consideration which shares can be issued. So even though most shares are issued at par value, they're usually sold far above par value. If there is no par value stated in the articles of incorporation, the board of directors may assign what's known as a stated value. We need to know par value and or stated value in order to determine stated capital. Stated capital, as you can see, is the par value and or stated value times the number of outstanding shares. You have a capital surplus when you look at shares that are actually worth more. It's the amount received per share minus the par value times the number of outstanding shares. So let's say a company has a par value of $1 in its articles of incorporation and has 1 million outstanding shares. That has a stated capital of $1 million. $1 times 1 million outstanding shares. However, they don't sell it for $1. When they sell it to the public, they sell it for $100. So the capital surplus would be the $100 received per share minus the $1 of par value times the 1 million outstanding shares, or 99 times 1 million, or $99 million of capital surplus. Now let's move on to debt securities. Debt is not stock. Stock is ownership. Debt is a loan. So corporations often borrow money by issuing debt. The board of directors has the inherent power to issue debt. They don't have to get shareholder approval. So debt, since it's not ownership, debt securities do not transfer ownership interest. Thus, usually the corporation is the debtor, and when they sell out debt to individuals, those individuals are the creditor. Debt can either be short-term or long-term in duration. Short-term is under a year. That would be a year or under. That would be a note. A long-term note could either be a debenture or a bond. That's over a year. If it's unsecured, it's a debenture. If it's secured and long-term, it's a bond. Regardless of whether it's short-term or long-term, all debt securities will have an indenture. And an indenture is the contract protecting the rights of the holder of the bonds. Take a few minutes and look at this slide. It's a great visual representation of both equity securities and debt securities. Let's move back over to equity or shareholders. What are the function of a shareholder? Well, the first thing that common shareholders do is to elect the board of directors via a proxy system. We'll talk about that in a minute. They also approve changes in the articles of incorporation and approve any extraordinary or unusual actions such as mergers. How does one acquire stock? Well, mostly they do it on an exchange, especially if it's a publicly traded corporation. However, it could be through an initial public offering when the corporation sells stock for the first time. Shareholders meetings, just like there are board of director meetings. There's usually an annual meeting and special meetings. Special meetings may be called by either the president, the top officer, the board of directors, holders of at least 10% of the shares, or anyone authorized by the bylaws to do so. With regards to quorum, it requires a quorum of shareholders present, but you don't have to keep the shareholders present once you get quorum. So how do you get 51% of shareholders to go to a meeting? They're never physically there. They're going to do it by proxy. In addition, you need to have notice of a shareholder meeting. Usually it's not less than 10 days or more than 50 days in advance. So common shareholders have a right to vote, as long as they own the common stock as of the record date. And again, most shareholders don't go to the annual shareholder meeting, they vote by proxy. A proxy means you appoint a person, also known as a proxy, to vote your shares for you. So the corporation pays for the preparation and mailing of the proxy, but the effect is that at the annual shareholders usually follow the recommendations of management. So in essence, the outcome of the shareholder meeting with regards to such things as voting for board of directors or changes to the articles of incorporation is known before the meeting is ever held. For closely held corporations, not publicly held corporations, but closely held corporations, oftentimes there's what's cumulative voting. Cumulative voting gives minority shareholders an opportunity to be represented on the board of directors. Shareholders also have rights at the shareholders' meetings. They have the right to be informed about the investment, so they can ask questions at the shareholder meeting to officers and directors, and they have right to govern the property interest, so they can propose resolutions. In addition, so you have the right to inspect records as a shareholder, as long as you have a proper purpose for doing so. In addition, for closely held corporations, it allows for preemptive rights. We've talked about this before. This allows, when there's more shares to be issued, it allows the existing shareholders to maintain the same relative percentage of interest in the corporation as before. So shareholders have a right to the profits of the corporation, but don't necessarily have the rights to dividends. Remember, dividends are payouts from the corporation of the profits from the corporation. The board of directors, pursuant to the business judgment rule, will decide whether dividends should be paid out to its owners. Remember, preferred shareholders have a preference to dividends over common shareholders. Dividends are usually paid in cash, but sometimes they're paid in other stock or in dividends. And please keep in mind that stock splits are not dividends because it doesn't increase the overall value of the shareholder's investment. So if remember, if a corporation has preferred shareholders, they have special rights with regards to preferred stock. There are different terms that I want you to know about. Non-cumulative preferred stock has preference over common shareholders whose dividends actually paid in that year. Cumulative preferred receives any omitted dividends from previous years before other common shareholders are paid. If dividends are cumulative to the extent earned, preferred shareholders have the right to dividends that have not been declared but previously earned before common shareholders are paid. Finally, participating means that preferred shareholders have received usual preference plus the right to share an additional income left over after the common shareholders have been paid their dividend. So they may get a second dividend. In addition, any extraordinary corporate transactions or amendments to the articles of incorporation must be approved by a majority of the common shareholders. Shareholders who vote against certain actions may have what's called appraisal rights. So if you vote no on something, you can demand that the corporation purchase back your shares at a fair value. Shareholders, since they're owners of the corporation, may also pursue lawsuits. So there are different types of lawsuits. The first type is an individual shareholder action. Here's where the shareholder actually sues the corporation for breach of their shareholder contract. If the individual shareholder wins, any judgment goes directly to that individual shareholder. Sometimes instead of doing an individual action, a bunch of shareholders will get together and maintain a class action. Again, if the shareholders win, the class of shareholders will get the judgment directly. A derivative action is different. Here is where the shareholder can sue as a representative of the corporation because somebody else has wronged the corporation. If the individual shareholder wins a derivative action and gets a judgment, any proceeds from that successful lawsuit do not go to the shareholder, but rather to the corporation. One of the great things about owning shares of stock is the limited liability that that owner or shareholder has. His or her loss is limited to the amount that he or she purchased the shares for. However, a shareholder who does not pay for the full value of the shares may be liable for the balance due. In addition, sometimes the board of directors declares a dividend that's illegal because there was no profits in order for the dividend to be paid. If such an illegal dividend was declared and paid out, it may be recovered from the shareholder only if he or she knew that the dividend was illegal to begin with. Finally, shareholders have the right to sell their shares at any time, and that always is in a publicly held corporation, but there may be restrictions in a closely held corporation. This concludes our lecture on Chapter 30, Financing the Corporation and the Role of Shareholders.